The film begins with some law enforcers from the old cowboy times in the United States arriving in a place called Creed. The area was completely destroyed, houses were burned down, trains were wrecked, and there were dead bodies everywhere. Only one woman survived, crying over her father's death. At that time, the leader of the law enforcers, Marshal John, was shocked and couldn't believe what he saw. One night, a woman had to shoot a man who broke into her house. Since he was still alive after being shot before, she brought him to her storage room. Meanwhile, a group of cowboy criminals visited a doctor named Elias Hobbs. The gang leader, Frank Griffin, had a badly injured hand and ordered Elias to cut it off right away. Outside, people said that Roy Goode was the one responsible for Frank's injury, and that he would have to pay for what he did. At the same time, a sheriff named Bill McNew was undergoing a ritual by an Indian shaman to heal his blurry vision. It turns out that the man who came to the two widowed women's house the previous night was Roy Goode, the very person Frank and his gang were hunting. Roy then shared his feelings of love and loneliness after leaving his old life behind. After being away for a while, Bill came back to his town. This town is mostly full of widows because many of their husbands died in a gold mine accident. People don't know much about Bill's past, but the widows think he's a coward. One of these widows, Alice Fletcher, owns the house where Roy is staying. Alice has a son named Truckee. Roy has trouble talking because Alice's mother shot him in the neck. When Bill returned to his home, he was welcomed by his youngest child and his sister, Mary Agnes McNew. Since her husband passed away, Mary started dressing like a tomboy because she needed to take care of the town. She told Bill that while he was gone, there were some troubles with bandits, but her deputies handled them. After his hand was cut off, Frank led his gang to continue hunting for Roy. They went into a church to scare people. There, Frank warned that if Roy came to the town and the people accepted him, Frank would kill everyone there. While exploring, Alice found a letter addressed to Roy from a woman named Lucy Cole. Shortly after, Alice told Roy he should leave the next day. Meanwhile, Frank and his gang returned to the spot where they lost Roy's trail. It turns out Roy is being hunted because he stole all the money Frank had taken. They struggled to find Roy's tracks because the ground was rocky. But Frank wasn't going to give up on finding Roy. On the other hand, Roy decided to go into Alice's wild horse stable. Soon after, Alice was surprised when she saw Roy in the stable, showing that he had a special talent for taming horses. There, Roy picked a black horse that he thought was the best, but the wild horse kicked him, causing him to fall. Then, Truckee asked Alice to invite Roy to eat with them, especially since it was Alice who had shot Roy in the neck before. However, Truckee's grandmother, Ivy, didn't like Roy. She had a feeling that Roy would bring trouble to their family. Suddenly, a woman arrived with her sick child, asking Ivy for help. Out of nowhere, a rattlesnake approached the child, and Roy quickly grabbed a gun and shot the snake, saving the child. This made Alice realize that Roy wasn't a bad person. Alice then told Roy that her first husband had died in a flood, and her second husband, who was also Truckee's father, had also passed away. Meanwhile, Marshal John came to town to meet Sheriff Bill. He told Bill about what had happened to the people in Creed. He also explained that for the past 7 months, Frank and his gang had been attacking mines to steal gold. Roy, the man they were chasing, had been a skilled shooter since he was 16 years old. He had taken off with $50,000 worth of stolen goods. The trouble started when Frank's gang sabotaged a train, causing it to derail. Even though the train had armed guards, they couldn't stop Frank and his men. The president of the mine, J.B. Sowards, was executed, and all his belongings were taken. His daughter was nearly assaulted by Frank's men, but Roy stepped in just in time to stop them. Roy even had the courage to steal the money that Frank's gang had taken. Shortly after, Frank's men chased after him, but 2 of them were caught and were about to be executed by the people of Creed. This made Frank and his gang return to Creed to kill everyone in the town, partly because Frank needed to have his badly injured hand amputated. The next day, Roy was showing how he could calm wild horses. He made each one of them relax and even fall asleep. At the same time, a barmaid told Marshal John that 83 men had died in the coal mine in just 5 minutes due to an explosion, which is why there are so many widows in the town. Later, Bill visited Alice's house to tell her about what had happened in Creed and about Roy, who was one of Frank's men and was being hunted. Alice didn't tell Bill that Roy was actually hiding in her house. Out of the blue, Bill confessed that he wanted to marry her. But then, Roy suddenly appeared and surrendered to Sheriff Bill. Roy explained that he had been in a gunfight with 30 of Frank's men before he got shot himself. He ran away and lost all the stolen money while crossing a river. Because of what he did, Roy was facing the possibility of being hanged. Bill then took Roy to the town jail. Meanwhile, a mining businessman named J.J. Valentine and his bodyguard came to town to make a business deal with the widows. The leader of the bodyguards was named Ed Logan. Elsewhere, a nun claimed that she saw Roy, the man being hunted by the law, digging a grave to get clothes off a dead body. She shared this with a newspaper publisher named Ed Grigg. In another scene, a skilled gunman named Whitey, who worked as Bill's deputy, was introduced. To protect Roy's identity and keep the town safe, Bill told everyone that the prisoner's name was Ward instead of Roy. During dinner, Valentine discovered that the town had been without its men for over 2 years. The women had been surviving by doing whatever they could, even selling themselves. On the other hand, Whitey told Roy that Alice had gotten into trouble while defending her land against a criminal. Bill had helped her during that time, but he got shot in the hip. Alice's second husband was eventually shot in the back and killed, but no one knows who did it. Soon after, Valentine and his engineer checked the gold mine in the town and thought it wasn't very valuable. However, Mary believed that the mine had a lot of gold. She offered to split the profits in half, but Valentine refused and only offered 10%. Out of the 83 miners who died, only one man, John Doe, survived. Then, Mary tried to negotiate for a better deal, but the other widows were more tempted by the $20,000 checks and the promise of hundreds of male workers coming to town. In the end, they were forced to accept the mining entrepreneur's offer. Later, Bill, who was lost in thought, heard gunshots from 2 thugs who were looking for someone. He told them to leave, but they laughed at him because he stumbled. Whitey quickly shot both thugs in the shoulders, forcing them to flee. It turned out that Bill's eyesight was getting worse, making it hard for him to see clearly. His vision problem started after his wife died during the birth of their youngest daughter. Back at the office, Bill asked again about Roy and Frank because he was worried that the gang would come to town sooner or later. Meanwhile, Grigg was shocked when he woke up to find Frank and his men in his house. Frank had seen the news about him and Roy in the newspaper, and Grigg knew the names of Frank's men. Frank threatened Grigg, warning him to write news that would make it clear he wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone in any town or village that was hiding Roy. The next day, Alice tried to tame her wild horses, but instead, the horses ran away. Bill planned to go after Frank with Marshal John, so he left the town in Whitey's care. And Alice, with Bill's help, managed to bring back her runaway horses. Afterward, Bill said goodbye as he needed to go on his mission. In another place, 2 families camping were suddenly attacked by Frank. At that time, Whitey was surprised when Alice showed up, insisting that he release Roy, also known as Ward, from his custody. Meanwhile, Frank threatened one of the women from the camping families, forcing her to stay with him. Soon after, Alice kicked Roy out of her house because she wanted him to teach her son how to control a horse. In exchange, she offered him one of her best horses. Roy agreed, but his only condition was that he wanted to learn how to read. At a restaurant, Bill was offered glasses by a colleague to help him read better. The colleague mentioned that he met 25 people at a gambling house who were planning to go to a place called Black Dom. After that, Bill sent a letter to Marshal John, inviting him to meet in the Olgand area. Meanwhile, Frank, noticing his severed hand pointing toward Old Grande, decided to search for Roy in that city, which was also Bill's destination. Later, Bill arrived at the place where Roy had fought against 30 of Frank's men. The scene shows how Roy, being chased, decided to shoot his tired horse and use it as a shield. He then took down Frank's men one by one, managing to knock out 7 gang members. He intentionally left Frank alive, aiming to make the gang retreat and change their course. Bill then encountered an Indian man who said he had seen what happened and even knew that Bill had trouble with his eyesight. Meanwhile, Marshal John asked Valentine for help to protect the widows in the town of La Belle from Frank's gang. But Valentine, confident in his own bodyguards, told John not to worry. Roy, on the other hand, was showing off his skills by taming the black horse. He successfully calmed the horse down and even rode it out of the stable. Despite Ivy doubting him, Roy managed to bring the horse back. Soon after, Whitey and the widows came to take Roy, also known as Ward, back. But Alice made a deal with them to sell her horse at a low price. Even though Whitey didn't agree, he couldn't do much since the widows accepted Alice's offer. Later, Marshal John got information from Grigg that Roy had been raised by a nun named Lucy from when he was a baby until he was 15 years old. Before leaving, Grigg gave him the nun's address in the town of Moses. Meanwhile, on his journey, Bill met the family that Frank had attacked. They told him that Frank's gang was heading to Old Grande, and the woman who was Frank's victim begged Bill to kill them all. In another part of the story, after having breakfast with Mary Agnes, Whitey went to a different area. Before entering the place, he put away his gun and deputy badge. It turned out that this place was mostly populated by black people. But Whitey wasn't there to arrest anyone, cause he claimed he had a different purpose. Meanwhile, Ivy got angry with Roy for wearing her late son's clothes and quickly told Alice, who was digging a well at the time. At that time, Roy was busy teaching Truckee how to ride a horse. Even though Truckee fell off a few times, Roy encouraged him to get back up and keep trying until he finally managed to control the horse. Seeing that, Louise's family could only smile as they watched Roy struggle to play the violin. Later, Roy felt proud because after some help from Alice, he was able to write his name for the first time. The next morning, Roy took Truckee to search for Alice's horse that had run away. After they found it, they ran into Ed Logan and his men. Roy claimed they were out hunting, but Ed Logan insulted them by spitting at them. When they got home, Truckee was upset that Roy didn't stand up to them. In another part of town, Ed Logan and his men returned to La Belle, declaring themselves the new sheriffs of the town. Meanwhile, Whitey learned that the men in Louise's family were called Buffalo Soldiers or Bulls. They were part of the 10th Cavalry, and after the war, their job was to hunt down people, mostly Apaches and others. They were excellent shooters, even better than other white men. Unfortunately, bad luck hit Marshal John when he arrived at a bar and was shot dead by Frank. In Marshal John's pocket, they found Lucy's address, and the story continued with the tragedy of an explosion in an underground gold mine. At that time, Whitey and some older men came to carry away the bodies of the many people who had died. Meanwhile, Bill didn't realize that Marshal John had been killed by Frank. Bill was frustrated with the town's sheriff for letting this happen without any resistance. However, the sheriff informed Bill that there was an army regiment nearby in the Laramie area on business. Bill also noticed that Marshal John's badge had been taken and was now being worn by one of Frank's men. On the other hand, Frank spotted a house in a field where someone had just arrived with a water drum. The house was being used as a shelter for people suffering from chickenpox. When Frank got closer, he found a woman named Lila trying to take care of the sick. Her whole family had died, and the doctor couldn't help anymore because he was also sick. Then, Frank decided to stay there for a while, along with the Devlin brothers, while the rest of his men set up camp near the river. Elsewhere, Ed Logan visited the settlement where Louise's family lived. He knew that these men were famous war veterans. They were farmers now, but they didn't get along with the townspeople because the town's mines polluted their water and land. At that time, Ed Logan offered to help with their water problems, but only if they agreed not to interfere with the town, which was now under his control. Meanwhile, Lila thought Frank was a good person, possibly even a priest, because he wanted to help her. But Frank was annoyed with his two men and ordered them to fetch water and dig graves for the dead. Flashing back to the past, Ellis remembered when she was trapped by a flood and some masked criminals tried to attack her. Fortunately, Bill and his wife arrived just in time to save her and several innocent children. They then brought Ellis to Mary for care. Back in the present, while tracking Frank, Bill met the Indian man again, who was able to tell that Frank and his gang were heading down the river. As rain fell on the town, Grigg went looking for Sheriff Bill and ended up meeting Whitey. Grigg showed Whitey a wanted poster for a fugitive named Roy because he heard that Bill had arrested him. When Whitey saw the poster, he realized that Ward looked a lot like Roy. Meanwhile, Roy went hunting deer with Truckee and Mary, while Alice stayed home alone. When they found a deer, Mary was eager to shoot it, but Roy wanted to teach Truckee how to do it. Just as Truckee was about to take the shot, the deer ran away. Later, at the river, Roy found a sunken carriage and a box filled with documents. The following day, Frank and 2 of his men left the shelter for sick people. That night, Roy remembered his childhood with his older brother, Jim, who was also on the run. They met Lucy that same night. There, Jim and Roy told Lucy they were from Moses, New Mexico, and were heading to California. Soon after, Lucy invited them to stay at her shelter with the other children. Back in the present, Whitey was swimming with Louise when her father caught them. Louise's father angrily sent Whitey away, telling him to stay away from his daughter. As Whitey was leaving, he saw Louise being beaten by her father. At that time, Whitey wanted to shoot him, but Roy appeared just in time to stop him. Meanwhile, Bill arrived at the shelter for the sick and found Marshal John's badge, but there was no one in the house except for dozens of graves behind it. After having dinner at Alice's house, Whitey said goodbye and returned to town. He thanked Roy for stopping him from making a big mistake. Whitey also mentioned that Grigg had brought a wanted poster with Roy's face on it. Flashing back to Roy's past, Jim left Roy at Lucy's orphanage, promising to return once he found a job. However, Roy felt hurt and sad because he never saw his brother again. In the present, while Bill was getting water from the river, Frank's gang suddenly surrounded him. At first, Bill lied and said he was just a lost worker, but Frank didn't believe him. Bill then admitted that he was a lawman following them. Nearby, an Indian man was also watching Bill, so Frank decided to let Bill go. Then, a surprising fact came to light that Roy's ability to handle horses was something he learned from Frank. In the past, when Frank rode a wild horse in front of Roy, a landlord shot at them, accusing Frank of stealing the horse. Both Frank and Roy were about to be hanged, but Frank's men arrived just in time to save them. However, Frank then told Roy to kill the landlord, who was still alive. Back in the present, Roy used his skills to tame Alice's wild horses one by one. He also started learning how to read. After a long time of digging, with Roy's help, Alice finally found water in her well. Roy felt satisfied because the horses were now tame, which meant his job at Alice's house was done. Meanwhile, Bill found an army camp and asked for help in capturing Frank, but his request was ignored. Even though many innocent people had been victims of Frank's gang, the army major told Bill to catch Frank on his own. At that time, Bill realized he had to hurry back to his town before Frank's gang got there. In another place, Frank arrived in Moses looking for Lucy. They were confronted by a man with a rifle. After dealing with him, the man told them that Nurse Lucy had moved to Ponca City 6 months ago. That night, Alice felt strong feelings for Roy, but was too scared to express them, and Roy felt the same way. In the past, young Roy left the orphanage because his older brother never came back. Roy tried to steal Frank's horse, but failed. After that, Frank took Roy in as his adopted son, taught him how to shoot, and turned him into a real gangster. In the present, Roy told Alice that he would help her take the horses to town, but after that, he planned to leave to settle things with Frank, far away from the town. Soon after, Alice, Roy, and Truckee took the horses to town together. Meanwhile, Grigg, still in town, learned about Alice, who the townspeople believed brought bad luck, which confused him. He wondered who Ward really was, as he knew Alice had released him from prison. The following day, Alice offered to sell her farm to another widow, but the woman planned to leave the town and didn't care about the mine reopening. While Roy and Truckee were waiting, Ed Logan approached them again. Roy stayed calm and didn't let Ed Logan's taunts bother him, even though Truckee really disliked him. It was also revealed that the Devlin brothers joined Frank after they killed their own family. Back in his office, Grigg planned to write an article to lure Frank to the town of La Belle because he had seen Roy with his own eyes. In another part of town, a detective asked Mary for help in finding a woman named Martha in La Belle. He was sent by Martha's husband. Mary told him that Martha had left a week ago to return to Germany, but secretly, Mary had told Martha, who was good at painting, to hide. Shortly after, Detective unexpectedly showed up, but Martha managed to shoot him in the leg. During the year he spent searching for her, the detective actually fell in love with Martha. Meanwhile, Roy was packing his things when he found an important letter sent by his older brother, who was in California several years ago. Flashing back to the past, Roy returned to the orphanage to give some money to Nurse Lucy. At that time, Lucy gave Roy a letter from his brother Jim. Lucy had received the letter a year after Roy had left the orphanage. Then, Roy rejoined his gang, but became angry when one of the members tried to force him to open the letter. Roy even beat up another gang member in front of Frank before disappearing. In the present, Roy had to leave Alice. Sometime later, Alice and Truckee read a letter left by Roy. The letter said that Jim had a wife and children and was now living in California. Jim apologized for leaving Roy when he was little and hoped Roy would come to California to be with him. Meanwhile, Frank's men found a newspaper with news about Roy being in the town of Belle, also known as the Town of Widows. After seeing this, the gang decided to head there. The next day, the story of Belle losing 83 men was revealed. On a bright morning, the men said goodbye to their wives as usual before heading to work in the underground gold mine. No one knew it would be their last goodbye. Later, one of the widows read an article written by Grigg to the other widows. They were shocked to learn that the town was accused of hiding a young man named Roy. This meant that the town could become a target for Frank's gang. Soon after, Ed Logan and the widows went to Alice's house to look for Roy, but he was already gone. Alice was stunned to learn that Bill had gone to arrest Frank to prove his love for her. The town became worried that Frank's gang would attack because they had sheltered Roy. To prepare for the gang's arrival, Ed Logan and his men went to ask for help from San Marcos. Mary suggested that the townspeople evacuate and hide in the forest to avoid getting hurt, but Alice refused because she needed to find her son, who had run away. Another problem arose when someone stole the widow's horses. Mary suspected that Ed Logan, who worked for Valentine, was the thief. The townspeople had no choice but to defend themselves using whatever weapons they could find, from machetes to kitchen knives. When Grigg arrived, Mary angrily spat at him. Meanwhile, Alice believed that Roy had gone to California because he took a map his brother had sent him. At the same time, Frank's men were also worried that the Black Dome Group, or the war veterans living nearby, might step in to help the widows, who seemed defenseless. The next morning, Whitey went to Louise's family to ask for help. Before this, Whitey and Mary had discussed teaming up with Louise's family and staying at the Hotel Belle, which was made of iron and brick, making it a perfect place to use as a bunker. The following day, Roy dug up his father's grave to retrieve weapons and money he had hidden there. Bill, on the other hand, found signs that Frank had been resting nearby. He also discovered that Frank had used his severed hand as a torch. Bill finally realized that Frank was heading toward Belle. That evening, Roy caught Ed Logan and his men, who had stolen the widow's horses. This time, Roy lost his patience with Ed Logan. Quick with his gun, Roy shot Ed Logan in the leg. Soon after, Bill arrived and urged Roy to head to the town, which was facing a serious threat. Roy then shot one of Ed Logan's men in the leg and threatened them to guard the widow's horses until he returned. Meanwhile, as Louise's family was discussing how to send help to the town, Frank and the Devlin twins arrived, pretending they needed water. Secretly, Frank's men surrounded the settlement. However, Louise's father realized that these men were Frank and his gang, who had come to massacre them, and a shootout began. Unfortunately, Louise's family, unprepared for the attack, was completely wiped out by the gangsters. But Louise was saved by Whitey. While Roy and Bill were resting, they both noticed an Indian man who had been following Bill. Surprisingly, Roy revealed that the Indian man was actually a ghost who couldn't swim, as Roy had once lived with his tribe. The next day, Mary distributed rifles to the widows so they could defend themselves in the hotel against the gangsters. As Alice searched for her son, she discovered that dozens of people at Louise's family's residence had been killed by Frank and his men. When Alice arrived in town, she faced a tough decision whether should she help the widows or go find her son. Mary reassured her that Truckee would be safer out there than in the city. At the same time, Ivy, through her vision, realized that Frank and his gang had reached the top of the hotel tower. Meanwhile, Mary and Alice saw a group of 30 gangsters on horseback, determined to kill anyone they believed was protecting their enemies. Whitey tried to confront them, but was immediately stabbed to death. At first, Frank and his men thought the town was empty, but suddenly, the widows opened fire. The widows fought bravely, determined to defend themselves, even as casualties fell on both sides. Soon after, Bill arrived with his gun and, seeing Whitey's body, became furious. The detective also went out to find Martha, who was fighting alongside the other women. As both sides paused to reload, Bill fearlessly confronted Frank, with Roy approaching from behind. Together, Bill and Roy overwhelmed Frank's gang, taking down all the gangsters without leaving anyone behind. As the battle ended, Grigg was injured by a shot from the widows. Once it was safe, Bill finally reunited with his two children. Meanwhile, Frank, who had managed to escape, found Truckee crying over his injured horse. To end the horse's suffering, Frank shot it. Not long after, Roy caught up with Frank and warned him not to touch Truckee. In the final showdown, Roy and Frank faced off in a duel. Roy shot first, ending Frank's life and bringing an end to the gangster leader's reign. Sometime later, the townspeople gathered for a funeral to honor those who had died in the recent events. Roy then said his goodbyes to Alice, Truckee, and Ivy as he prepared to continue his journey to California. Before leaving, Roy and Bill met one last time to talk. After that, Alice finally accepted Bill's love after waiting for a long time. Meanwhile, Roy began his long journey, traveling through barren fields and snowy mountains. Later, Alice was surprised to find that Roy had left money for her buried in the ground. Eventually, Roy reached the top of a hill and saw California in the distance. And with that, the film came to an end. The moral lesson from this film is keep your cowboy hat on tight and always carry a shovel because you never know when wild horses, gangsters, or surprise cash might show up.